historians of yesteryear and an avowed skeptic. Listen to what Mr. Leckie had to say about Jesus' place in history. Now, we're not talking about the theological Jesus now. We've moved beyond that. We're not talking about the theological Jesus. We're just talking about the historical Jesus. Where does he fit in? You have Caesar Augustus, you have Alexander the Great, you have Jesus, you have all of these, Muhammad, you have these various historical figures, and we're going to just pan out here a little bit and get a little objectivity, because I can't provide the kind of objectivity that a non-believer could, only because I've committed my life to the man, and he's changed my life, and I believe that he really is the Son of God who he claimed to be. But Mr. Leckie, who was himself an avowed skeptic, and who was one of the historians of modernity, a great historian of modernity. Let's hear what Mr. Leckie has to say. The character of Jesus, the historical Jesus, not the theological Jesus, the historical Jesus. The character of Jesus has not only been the highest pattern of virtue, but the strongest incentive in its practice, and has exerted so deep an influence that it may be truly said that the simple record of three, I want you to hear this. This is somebody who doesn't particularly like Jesus, at least not theologically. It may be truly said that the simple record of 3 short years of active life has done more to regenerate and soften mankind than all the disquisitions of philosophers and all the exhortations of moralists. That's the historical Jesus, my friends. When Jesus was crucified, he had just a few more followers than you could hold up on your 2 hands. Today there are 6.3 billion people on planet Earth, and roughly 1/3 of those people claim to be followers of Jesus. I want to ask you a simple question. Has the historical Jesus influence increased over the centuries or decreased over the centuries? Radically increased. How can you go from having like 20 followers to having like 2 billion and say that his influence has not increased? He never wrote a book, he never got a degree, he never did any of the things that we commonly associate with success, and yet there's hardly a person on earth today who hasn't at least heard his name, and 1 in every 3 people on earth today is staking their life and their future life on the fact that the guy was who he said he was. The historical Jesus. The greatest man in history, Jesus Christ, had no servants, yet they called him master. Had no degrees, yet they called him teacher. Had no medicines, yet they called him healer. He had no armies, yet kings feared him. He won no military battles, yet he conquered the world. He committed no crime, yet they crucified him. He was buried in a tomb, and yet he lives today. And by almost all scholarly accounts, he died by the age of 33. It's not like he had decades and decades and decades to accomplish. In fact, even though he died sometime in his mid-30s, his public ministry was only 3.5 years long. I want you to think about that. This is one guy who does his ministry for 3.5 years, and the whole world knows about it. C.F.D. Moule, a theologian at Cambridge University, said, if the coming into existence of the Christians, the Nazarenes, a phenomenon undeniably attested to by the New Testament, rips a great hole in history, a hole the size and the shape of the resurrection, what does the secular historian propose to stop it up with? The birth and the rapid rise of the Christian church remain an unsolved enigma for any historian who refuses to take seriously the only explanation offered by the church himself. What Mr. Moule is saying is so simple and so easy to understand. He says, okay, you don't believe in the resurrection? Then explain Christianity. How do you have, and I don't want to get into too much detail here, but very quickly, how do you have the Roman world, which has been worshiping the sun and the emperor for untold ages, how do you have, for century after century after century after century, an absolutely pagan empire that within 2 centuries of the crucifixion of Jesus suddenly becomes a Christian empire? How do you explain the absolute evangelistic zeal of those early disciples, of those early church members, if Jesus didn't actually rise from the dead? You see, historians are just like scientists. If a scientist sees an effect, he will posit a cause. She will posit a cause. Okay, so there's an effect. The shoe has moved across the stage. And so what you're going to do is you're going to posit a cause that is consistent with the effect observed. So too in science, physics, so too in history. So here's what a historian does. A historian surveys the historical landscape, and when they see something major happening, some interpolation, some big thing that happens, they're going to ask the question, what caused that? If you have a small effect, like a shoe being thrown across the stage, all you need is a small cause, me swinging my arm. It's very simple. But if the whole building moved 5 feet to one side, we would have to posit I know, I look at the size of those things, but you would have to posit a stronger effect than my arm just moving like this. I know that's surprising to some of you, but it's true. I tried it earlier. I can't quite move it. But the point is this. A scientist says, here's an effect. What's the appropriate cause? A historian says, here's an effect. Christianity sweeps the Greco-Roman world in 2 short centuries, and the Roman emperor himself, Constantine being the first, actually professes Christianity. The historian says, what caused that? How do you get a little ragtag, motley crew group of Jews, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 in number, to totally sweep the Greco-Roman world in just under 2 centuries? That's Mr. Moole's point. He says, when you look at history, you got a great big hole in history. And he says it's the size and the shape of the resurrection. Okay, so you don't believe the resurrection. Fine. He says, what are you going to stop it up with? Explain it. Please explain. Mr. Craig is even more to the point. Dr. William Lane Craig says, thus, none of the previous counter-explanations can account for the evidence as plausibly as the resurrection itself. One might ask, well then how do skeptical scholars explain the facts of the resurrection appearances, the empty tomb, and the origin of the Christian faith? Okay, here it is. How do skeptical scholars explain it? The fact of the matter is, says Craig, they don't. They don't explain it. They ignore it. Modern scholarship recognizes no plausible explanatory alternative to the resurrection of Jesus. Those who refuse to accept the resurrection as a fact of history are simply self-confessedly left without an explanation. These 3 great facts, the resurrection appearances, the empty tomb, and the origin of the Christian faith, all point unavoidably to one conclusion: the resurrection of Jesus. Today, the rational man, and I consider myself to be at least somewhat rational, can hardly be blamed. Listen to what he's saying. The rational man can hardly be blamed if he believes on that first Easter morning that a divine miracle occurred. The testimony of history. And finally, and for me most significantly, is the testimony of my own personal experience, and I can do this very quickly. I became a Christian at the age of 23, almost 24 years old. I can tell you that the life that I was living, the experience that I was having, the person that I was before I became a Christian bears no resemblance to the person you see before you today. And I'm not talking about physicality. I'm just talking about the person that I was in my character, in my demeanor, in my attitude. God has changed my life. There was a cold, windswept room in Laramie, Wyoming, when I knelt down June 6, 1996, and invited Jesus Christ, the man of history, to come into my heart. The prayer went something like this: God, I'm not even sure you're there. But if you are there, please come into my life and change me, because I'm afraid of who I'll become if you're not real. Beloved, I could have never anticipated the change that would take place in an aimless, wayward 23-year-old punk rocker. That's what I was. I was a punk rocker. Studying medicine at the University of Wyoming, purple hair, pink hair, blue hair, red hair, no hair, long hair, dreadlocked hair, tattoos, earrings. I was just a punk rock kid studying medicine. I had no interest in religion. I had no interest in God. I was hostile toward religiously minded peoples. And so I can tell you I had no predisposition to be interested in religion, but God has changed my life. I've actually played some of the bands that I used to play in. I've actually shown my wife some pictures and played for her some music that I used to play. I was in punk rock bands for years. And I'd say, hey, sweetie, come listen to this. And she's like, ah! She was raised a good Christian, you know. She's like, ah! Who is that maniac? me. And I can tell you, I wish Violetta were here, I can tell you that she has literally looked me deadpan in the eyes and said, that is not you. It's like she just refuses to believe it. She's like, I'm not getting in bed with anything that is that or was that. It's not happening. She's like, that was not you. No, it was me, really. Look, listen to this one. She's like, ah! She's running out of the room. She can't take it. And you think I'm kidding. It was worse than that, I'll tell you that. Beloved, the testimony of my own experience, God has done something in my life, and I'm not just whistling Dixie here, I'm not just being facetious. God has changed me. There were things in my life that I wanted to stop. There were things in my life that I wanted a piece of sense of security. I wanted a sense of meaning. I wanted a sense of hope. I wanted a sense of destiny. I wanted to be the man that I knew I could be, but I didn't have the power, and God has changed me into something. I'm not perfect, and I wouldn't even profess to be close, but I can tell you the man I am today is not the man I was then. The testimony of my own experience. Yet I say to you, said Malcolm Muggeridge, and I beg you to believe me, multiply these tiny triumphs by millions, add them all up together, said Mr. Muggeridge, and I completely concur, and they are nothing, less than nothing, indeed a positive impediment when measured against one drop of that living water that Christ offers to the spiritually thirsty, irrespective of who or what they are. On one occasion, Jesus put a rather forthright question to the religious leaders of his day. He asked them this question, and I want to ask you this question tonight. Jesus said, what do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he? That's what he said. It's in Matthew chapter 22, verse 42. He said, hey, what do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he? Surely this is the question of the ages. Whose son was he? You know who that man is? His name is Larry King. I don't know if you get Larry King live here in the States, or here in Australia, but it's huge in the States. It's probably the #1 talk show in the United States. Larry King, he's a talker. He's really quite an amazing fellow. And he's interviewing everybody. I mean, he's interviewing everybody. He interviews heads of state. He interviews movie stars, he interviews rock stars, he interviews authors, writers, celebrities, bankers. He interviews everybody. And several years ago, I saw a very interesting program. I didn't actually see it, but I saw the transcript of it. Larry King was interviewed on his own show. Well, that's kind of cool. The guy who's asking everybody questions is going to be on the receiving side now. And I don't remember who the interviewer was. But one of the questions that he put to Mr. King was this. Larry King, if you could interview anybody, if you could just interview anybody, you've had the privilege to sit down beside in your little studio here with the elite of the world, but if you could interview anyone throughout history, who would you interview? And without hesitation, Mr. King responds, I would interview Jesus Christ. What? The interviewer was a little taken back by that. He said, oh, really? Jesus Christ? Well, why? I mean, surely you can do better than that. Why? And Mr. King's response was absolutely fantastic. He said, I would ask him, were you indeed virgin born? I just want to ask him one question. Were you really born of a virgin? To which the interviewer says, well, why would you ask him that? And he says, because the answer to that question would determine the answer to nearly every other question I have in life. I just ask him one question. Were you who you claim to be? Whose son are you? Jesus claimed to be the Son of God. Jesus claimed to be God himself. Jesus claimed to be the sole point of access to God. It's not just about a turning point, beloved. It's about a turning person. The question for each of us tonight, and really the question for the rest of us, for all of us for the rest of our lives, is whose son was he? You cannot be casual about Jesus. Mr. Lewis has already told us that that is an impossibility. I mean, the guy was either lying, he was lunatic, or he was who he claimed to be, the Lord of glory. So the question for each of us here tonight, whether you're a believer, whether you're a skeptic, whether you're religiously interested or religiously disinterested, is this simple question. Whose son was he? Was he the son of Joseph? Or was he the son of God? Because on that question, says Mr. King, and he's exactly right, hinges every other question. Tonight we've looked at 5 lines of evidence. The testimony of Jesus Christ about himself, the testimony of those that were closest to him, his disciples, the testimony of his self-styled enemies, the testimony of history, and my own personal testimony tonight. I can report to you that Jesus Christ is who he claimed to be. He is Savior, he is King, he is friend, and there are very, very good reasons for believing that. And tonight I want to give you the opportunity to respond to what you have heard, to respond to the presentation. We have some ushers who are going to be handing out a card, and I want you to take a moment to look at this card. It will take just a few moments. The ushers are moving very rapidly. Look at how rapid the ushers are moving. The ushers are going to put a card in your hand, and it's very simple. It's not a hard sell. It's very simple. It's very basic. And when you get that card, some of it's going to be easy because it says your name, your address, your city, your contact phone number. Very easy. Tonight you've heard the presentation, and I want to give you an opportunity to respond to this presentation. So start by filling out the obvious ones, the ones you know. Your name, your address, where you're from. Please write legibly. And right there in the upper right-hand corner of the card is the question, do you plan to attend the follow-up program at the Sydney Entertainment Center starting Monday night? This was the first of 7 presentations. I want to know if you can come. If you're planning on coming, if you want to come, you're invited. If you're planning on coming, then check yes. If you're not planning on coming, then check no, but we hope you are. Start with that. Question number 2 there says, how did you find out about tonight's program? I'd be curious to know how you found out about the program. Maybe somebody handed you a flyer. Maybe a friend called you and invited you. Maybe someone in town said there's this crazy American speaking tonight and you need to hear him. How did you find out about this program? I want to know. We want to know, how did you hear about this program? Please put that on there. I want to thank the ushers for moving so efficiently. And then over in the bottom left-hand corner of the card, you'll notice that there are 3 boxes. Box number 1, box number 2, and box number 3. Now, this is very simple. If you have understood tonight's presentation, if it has been clear to you, the basic thesis, I want you to check box number 1. Just check box number 1. Checking box number 1 basically is saying, I understood. I got it. Message sent, message received. That's box number 1. Tonight, I understood the program. I understood the basic thesis about the 5 lines of evidence. I understood it. Doesn't mean you believe it, but just you understood the concepts. Box number 2, I want you to check that if you believe what you have heard tonight. You say, I believe what I heard tonight. Not only did I understand it, but I believe it. I believe that Jesus was who he claimed to be. You can think of this as a kind of intellectual assent. Yes, I believe that. And the third box, I want you to check if you want to accept Jesus Christ into your own heart. Not merely as an historical figure, not even as a theological figure, but as your own personal Savior. Someone who can take you and make you what you want to be and what you know you want to be. There's not a person in this room who doesn't have hopes and dreams and hurts and desires, aspirations, pains. And I want to testify tonight in your presence that Jesus is just the person that you need. He's real, He is loving, and He is alive. And so check box number 1 if you understood the presentation, box number 2 if you agree with the presentation, and box number 3 if you want to accept Jesus Christ as your personal Savior.